Hello, welcome to MoonCon 22. And this is your friendly Druid panel with a new constituent this time because we've got Julie Brett all the way from Australia with us. I should point that way, shouldn't I? Whichever way. We'll just introduce ourselves briefly and then we'll get on with the chat. So I'm Brendan Howlin, long-time OBOD Druid and Druid Tutor. And over to Julie.
I'm Julie, and in Australia we acknowledge the country that we're on. So I'm in Darug and Gundungurra country in Australia, which is also known as the Blue Mountains. And I'm really happy to be here. It's great. Brendan? Oh, sorry.
And Robin?
Yeah.
I'm Robin Herne. I'm not an OBOD member, but I've been a Druid for a great many years now, independently practicing rather than allied to a specific order. And I'm based in Suffolk, not where I was born. I'm London overspill, but yes, very much rooted. We are chatting in the prelude to this going live about the importance of place. So my place is very much Suffolk, yes, which is on the East Coast, just in case.
My place is very much Surrey, which is 30 miles south of London, so between London and the coast. Surrey is the most populated county in the UK, but also the most wooded, which is kind of a contradiction.
Everyone's squeezed in
right, yeah,
to allow room for the trees.
That's right. Yeah.
I lived there for a bit when I was little, before we came to Australia. So.
Oh, right, okay. So you're a Surrey girl. Excellent.
Do you have strong memories?
Yeah.
I remember walking to school in the snow, and I remember sitting in the grass that had buttercups and daisies in it, which was very different to here. And I remember walking a lot in mud with my family up big hills. But yeah, no, fond memories of nature, I guess. But yeah, we moved here when I was 6, so they're not very in-depth memories.
Yeah, because
we've had a really...
Guildford is famous for the North Downs, so on the chalk ridge, so those hills would have been those, yeah?
Yeah, well, I just have this vivid memory of walking up a hill that was a very muddy path, but I quite enjoyed it. You know, kids love walking in the mud. Yeah, so I'm sure there's lots of other beautiful places. That's just what my strong memories are. Yeah. There's lots of lovely memories of forest.
Oh, just Julie mentioned daisies. We've had a lovely display of oxeye daisies 5 minutes up the road where I walk the dog. They're at the end now, so they're on the wilt, but it's one of my favourite times of year because there's one of the places I walk my dog, my Malamute, is knee deep in oxeye daisies and a variety of other wildflowers as well. And for those sort of 2 weeks that the blooms are fresh, it's absolutely lovely. Yeah. Just to kind of walk through the aromas and getting an idea of what Ipswich, which is the part of Suffolk I live in, what it would have looked like decades and decades ago before it became quite as heavily built on as it is these days, when there would have been a lot more green space. Although that said, we do have some really big parks in Ipswich, which is a miracle from previous generations of aristocrats who willed their country estates to the people of the town when their family lines died out, and were clever enough to create trusts in their wills that prevented the burghers of Ipswich from selling off the land and having it concreted over. So I know a lot of Druids aren't mad keen on aristocracy, but occasionally you get an aristocrat who makes a very sensible decision and knows what a bunch of sleazebags politicians tend to be when it comes to selling off anything that's not nailed down. So they make damn sure they can't sell off the land that's given over to the people of Ipswich.
Good. So we're getting heavily into the spirit of place and localized Druidry, which is something we really want to talk about. But if you tuned in wanting to hear about the metaverse, I suppose we should deal with that, really, yeah? That came up because Luke Eastwood was going to be on this panel, and he's written several articles on it. And of course, we haven't, so we'll have to give you our take on it. Who wants to go first? Do you want to go, Julie?
So how are we approaching it? What's the question here? How does Druidry work with the metaverse?
Druidry in the metaverse,
yeah. I think we can, but it's limited, and it's best combined with real world practice. I don't have much experience with virtual reality type metaverse. I'm not sure if we're also including joining on a Zoom chat like we are now. Some people are doing that for ritual, where people all over the world are joining together to listen to a meditation that's perhaps guided with visualizations, and people imagine coming into a sacred grove together. Or there's also things like Second Life, which is where people create an avatar and they go into a virtual space to have rituals. And I think those can be really powerful, especially if we're working with the inner worlds a lot. But the aspect of working with nature and being present in nature and having rituals that are about, localized places, I think it's quite limited for that. Though, certainly through COVID, we've had the opportunity to work with these things out of necessity. So it's been quite an interesting learning curve getting to use those things when we weren't able to get together. But personally, I don't think you can substitute the real thing. I think getting together out in nature and in the real world is where it's at for me. Robin?
Totally agree. During lockdown over here, it was better than nothing as a way to keep in contact with fellow members of the Druid group I'm part of, and people that are kind of further afield away, just as a means to chat, really. The idea of virtual ritual completely leaves me cold. I just can't see the point of it. Bunch of people on the camera waving a candle, calling to the east, the west, or whatever they're doing, when they are geographically all over the place, and you've got an imaginary east, an imaginary north, and imaginary west. I just, if it works for other people, great for them, but the idea leaves me bewildered. The whole point of Druidry, I think, and it's not always easy to elucidate the differences between the various traditions. But for me, Druidry is very much of the place. That's one of its distinct features. You could probably say that of paganism in general, couldn't you? But it's very much centered in place. Although I do appreciate not all Druids are pagan, before anyone points that one out. I do know that. But the pagan element for me is that we're here, we're now in this field, this forest, this garden, this whatever it may be, and we tune into the land there, rather than this weird notion of virtual place, which I'm sure for younger generations, bearing in mind I'm about 3,000 years old now, for younger generations, I'm sure growing up with it seems more natural to understand cyberspace as space, as a place. But for me, it's weird. No, can't do it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that one definition of Druidry is learning to live more fully in the real world, in the here and now. So the metaverse certainly wouldn't cover that. I was thinking about this. We have some tutees who can't visualize things, and they struggle with a lot of the guided meditations that we do in the course. And I wondered if you could have a virtual meditation guided journey that people could go into and see that might help people like that. Of course, if you can't do that, then you do it your own way and you get the benefits anyway. But that's the only benefit I think you might have, be able to give people a guided meditation into a place.
I could see a benefit in terms of sound effects. So we're walking by the beach and the noise of the sea is playing. I can see that as a stimulus for the what do we call it these days? Visually challenged, or whatever the term is for people who can't visualize terribly well. But if you've got lots of visual imagery coming up on the screen, isn't that just a film? So you might as well just go and watch a film.
Because I guess you're always aware that you're actually sitting here in the
Yes.
chair in front of your computer. You must be, obviously, yeah.
Yeah.
You can't really get out of that, yeah.
I think we can add quite a lot of richness to these experiences with things like a visual aid, or like you could have like a fire burning or something like that. You can get these looped videos or something like that. Or like you say, sound effects. We made some for our community with lots of different sound effects that help people to walk through a forest with wind and birds calling and things like that. It was quite fun, really, and we enjoyed doing it. But I think that what's missing is, the magic of actual relationship with the earth. Like
Yes.
that's got to be what's missing. And that's the basis of our tradition. I mean, surely inner work is important too, but the most powerful experiences so many of us have are in nature and with other people as well. I think when we have group meditations in each other's presence, it kind of helps us build that energy together.
I'd add that the inner work thing, if you are lying in a field or lying under a tree or whatever, doing your guided meditations, you're still physically conscious of the sounds of the birds singing in the trees, even if your guided meditation is, you're walking up the side of a volcano or something. So your mind may be going in one direction, but your body is still centered. And I think that centering, particularly for people who are possibly apt to mentally wander off and maybe find the physical world a bit of an off-putting place. I think having that centering, that grounding element can be a very important anchor to help people get back to their body rather than just sort of float away into la land and never quite come back again. So.
Yeah, I think that but you could imagine like lying under a tree or being out in nature and listening to a guided meditation that had been recorded. Or even listening to a live talk if you have your phone with you, or a live ritual or something like that, where you could even be standing in your ritual space doing it while listening to other people. I think that like there's potential there for a more connected experience with these things, and perhaps it's just a matter of us working on this a little bit more for people to get further with it. So. We did some rituals where we all went for a walk as a solo exercise and found a tree, and we all found the same kind of tree, which was the Banksia, and then we all brought a piece of the Banksia to our meditation. We did a guided meditation together, and then we all shared what was about, but we had a piece of the tree in front of us, so we were connecting with the tree during the meditation. I think that's probably the place where I can see it coming together. So you wanted to offer a definition of the metaverse, did you?
Well, not personally. I thought it might be useful for anyone listening who, a bit like me, when somebody first mentioned, let's talk about the metaverse, and I thought...
Here's a definition on the bottom of the screen there now, yeah. A virtual reality space which users can interact with a computer-generated environment and other users. There you go.
There we go.
Thank you very much.
So, in some ways, we're on the metaverse right now.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's nothing... Well, I suppose the computer element is certainly new, but back in the day, when I was lighter and less of me, which is quite a long time ago now, you could buy audio recordings and tapes, cassettes, that sort of thing, with guided meditation on. So the idea of in the loose sense of the word, a device which enhances your meditation is not a new concept. Certainly, obviously, it would go back 100 odd years. I suppose it would have all been do it the old-fashioned way. But as technologies have come along, people have capitalized upon cassettes and LPs and whatnot as the generations have gone past. So I suppose doing it online is just the latest incarnation of using technology.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess we've probably given that sufficient airing now, and it's kind of segueing nicely into localized practice. So obviously we are part of the place where we live. We are, some people say a druid is the land, yeah? So you are a druid of your locality, and that's what makes you a druid. So in my case, it's the woods, the hills, and the streams of Surrey very much make me what I am, and I love going out in them, meditating in them, walking in, spending time in it. Yeah. So localized practice certainly is important to me. What about Julie? You've got a different environment to us, haven't you?
That's always been a really important part of how I've approached things, because it is so different here, and it's been a challenge for so many of us living in Australia, wanting to do Druidry, which is so grounded in our well, for me, it's my ancestors. It's where I was born. It's where I've come from, and it's traditions that I really love. I love all the storytelling, and I have those memories of when I was a kid living there, and we visited a lot when I was a kid too, and growing up. So I had that, a foot in both worlds, I suppose. And I wanted to acknowledge that, but I also wanted it to make sense here, where the seasons are incredibly different. The plants and animals are really different. The seasons are really different. And we have bushfires, and trees that need bushfire to regenerate. We have very different kinds of landscapes, and where I was growing up, life really revolved around the ocean. But now I live in the Blue Mountains, and it's a very different environment here. And yeah, so getting to know different places, I think you become a different kind of druid in different places that you live in, as you get to know them. So yeah, what's it like for you, Robin?
I've been living in Suffolk for almost 30 years now, so I haven't had the sort of changing of environment recently. Before that, I moved around a great deal, but I have to say prior to that, I was more interested in other types of paganism. So the Druidry roughly coincided with my move to Suffolk, although it wasn't an intentional thing, it just sort of arose. So my experience of Druidry is very much one of remaining in the same place for a long period of time. And it does pose interesting links in the part of the country I live in. We don't have the stone monuments and so forth that they do in other parts of the country, because we just don't have that much natural stone over here. So as far as we are aware, whatever the Iron Age tribes were getting up to in what eventually became called Suffolk, it would probably have been inside wood henges or something of that nature, wooden monuments, carved pillars, whatever, the kind of thing that rots away to nothing and doesn't leave interesting spiritual sites to go and visit in the centuries to come. Were I living over in the West Country or Cornwall or Devon or in places like that, Wales, there would be ludicrously large numbers of places to go and visit. So that is something I'm quite conscious of, that whatever bits of Suffolk and so forth were sacred 2,000 years ago, we don't necessarily know it anymore, because whatever monuments would have stood there to mark the spot, they've long since gone. And whilst it's not quite the same thing as being in an entirely different country with an entirely different set of religious traditions, there is that slight sense of, for me at least at any rate, slight sense of disconnect, of having almost to create sites anew and wander around places and try and tune in to what might have been there 2,000, 2,500 years ago. You never quite know if you're just going a bit Fruit Loop and imagining stuff. But then that is, I suspect, an inherent problem to a great deal of esoteric work, is learning what is wishful thinking and what is picking up on something that is objectively there. So it's a slightly different experience for me than I think it would be for, say, someone practicing Druidry in Wales, in Ireland, in Yorkshire, in places where there are a lot of sacred sites that date way back to the Neolithic, let alone to the Iron Age. So places that have been in probably relatively continuous use for a very, very, very long period of time.
Yeah, I can take what you say on that, yeah. But we're fortunate in OBOD in that we go to Stonehenge as an order once a year, and we meet for the sun coming up 2 weeks before the solstice, because it's too crowded at the solstice time. But to actually get into Stonehenge, which was abandoned for 1,000 years before the Druids even got here yet. Yeah. But to get into that place and chant and things, and you realise it's meant to be a sound chamber. You can hear the stones ring when you're chanting, and the experience is absolutely fantastic. And that is going back to a culture that isn't Druidic, but we are sharing their spiritual heritage.
Proto-Druidic, perhaps we could put it.
You could, yeah.
Francis Pryor makes, I can't remember, is it Britain BC, I think, one of his books, where he speculates that the people who did erect Stonehenge in Avebury, whilst he's not saying they were Druids, because clearly that word wasn't in use back at that point in time, he's arguing that they were essentially pre-Druids, that what they started would eventually turn into, by the Iron Age, the thing that we now call Druidry. So rather than seeing it as two distinct groups, he's seeing it as a sort of one, as almost like an evolution or a reincarnation of the other.
Yeah, that's good, yeah. I guess there are lots of sacred sites in Australia, Julie, yeah?
Well, I think you sort of get the impression here that everywhere is a sacred site. And that what joins them together is these stories. So yeah, learning about Aboriginal culture, because you can't learn about the sacredness of the land here without starting to look at Aboriginal culture, I think. And a lot of elders and communities are really quite generous in sharing their stories. And so, we learn about certain landforms. They're not necessarily things that people have made. I mean, they rarely are, really. Sometimes there are places that have been made or that are very, very old, like the Brewarren of fish traps, which are really, really old. But that's a long way from where I am. But here we've got things like the Three Sisters, which is part of a Seven Sisters songline, which goes all the way across the country and relates to the Pleiades. And yeah, there's all these landforms that have names and have stories that link those landmarks together. So that's sort of what we learn about here. But then there's also that personalized sense of connection with place. Maybe we have our community gardens, which isn't. I've asked whether it's somewhere that we shouldn't use if it was a sacred site, and they have told me it's okay. But it's sacred for us because we do ritual there all the time. So there's a labyrinth there and spaces that we meet regularly for our rituals. So it becomes sacred to us. I've got a question in that regard, I suppose, about stories and the landscape in the places where you live. Like, it's not necessarily just about stone circles and standing stones. I think it's also about the names of landmarks and the folklore and stories that they're about. That there's the kind of giant stories about, that's the head of this person, or that's the pile of rocks left by a witch or something. I love those stories. Is there anything like that in the places where you live?
Yes,
there is in Guildford. It's a place called the Silent Pool, which is quite near us, and it's called Silent Pool because it's eerily quiet and it's clear blue water. You can see through to the bottom of it, and of course, I'll show you this. Silent Pool distillers, they make gin, yeah, and they use the water as a silent pool for it. But there's a big history associated with it, folklore of a lady was bathing in the pool, and wicked King John came along on his horse and wanted to have his evil way with her, and she wouldn't come out of the pool and drowned. Bear in mind, the pool's only about a foot deep. So this legend is emblazoned on their literature and things, yeah. So you get a beautiful bottle with the whole story of the Silent Pool on it, on their gin, which is really quite fascinating. So people are making more of that place, yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Robin?
Oh, well, we have our stories in Suffolk. They're not ancient stories. They tend to go back 500 years, 800 years, 1,000 years. And there are some connected to thinking of kind of changing traditions. There's a village in Suffolk that's about the size of a postage stamp called Cheddiston. And in it is an alluvial deposit of a standing stone that during the Ice Age, as the icebergs were going across the country, it was deposited there. It's at some point in history, it's snapped in half, so it used to be a lot taller than it is these days, and is currently in someone's back garden as a fluke. And within the Christian tradition, it's referred to as St. Ched's Rock. The idea that St. Ched, a saint from quite a few hundred years ago, used to stand on the rock and preach to the converts in the area. And before that, it was referred to as Odin's Rock. And we've had certainly heathens from various other parts of Europe come in hundreds of years ago and colonize large swathes of Suffolk. And it's also earlier referred to as the Druid's Rock. So it's probably, as a focal point, been utilized, recycled, whatever word you want to use, by generation after generation of different religions, different traditions. And nowadays, I say, it's just a rock in someone's garden who thankfully doesn't mind weirdos coming into their garden to a point and going, oh, look, rock, and marking the event in a very subdued fashion, because you can't get too leery in someone's back garden when they've been kind enough to allow you in there in the first place. So there is obviously how people over the generations have understood that rock, I'm sure, has changed 50 times over, and the stories change, and It does raise questions as a storyteller myself. There's all sorts of issues that arise as to notions of truth in storytelling. Some stories I just make up on the spot, so clearly they are made up because they didn't exist 5 minutes earlier. But at some point, all stories will have been made up by somebody. A 1,000-year-old story, a 2,000-year-old story was made up by somebody at some point. So is a story that was made up 10 years ago of less value than a story that was made up 1,000 years ago?
Or are there other values on stories? Something really fascinating about learning about the songlines and how oral cultures generally use stories as a mnemonic device for wayfinding. It's quite fascinating. The story doesn't need to be true. It just has to help you get from one place to the next. So if you have the hill that looks like it's been cut off on the top, and then the rock that looks like a shield, and then the place where we go across the water, that could be one story, but it's tied together with something like the Toyne,
Yes, it's a story
in Irish mythology, which has got things like that in it. There's a wonderful story about Finn McCool. I've come across quite a lot of Irish ones recently that are quite good examples. The story of Finn McCool when he has to fight Cuchulainn and he comes over on the Giant's Causeway, and they live on mountains and they're giant people, and they throw a butter churn across the valley, and it's a big rock there in the valley that has fingerprints in it, and it tells you where bilberries grow on the hill, and that there's an indent area near the house that looks like a ruin, and you can almost imagine the landscape through these stories. And it's quite fascinating that these stories may have been used by people to find landmarks to show you the way. If you don't have a map, how do you get from one place to another? If you tell a story about the places that are quite, easy to remember and visually relevant in the landscape, that can be really helpful for wayfinding. I think that's just such a fascinating way of looking at mythology, where it doesn't have to be about whether it was true or not. It's not necessarily about history. It's quite a Roman way of thinking about writing, actually. Whereas, oral cultures, there's so many different layers about what the story's about.
Absolutely. And it does beg the whole notion of what do we mean when we say something is true anyway? Do we simply mean this definitely happened in the sequence it is claimed to have happened? Or a map story that gets you from A to Z safely has a functionality, and functionality is a form of truth in and of itself. It helps you to achieve something. Whether or not there actually was a giant there once upon a time lobbing around boulders is kind of, as you say, is pretty much besides the point, because that's not the purpose of the story. The purpose of the story is more of a functional mapping one. So we have those kinds of stories where I live, and it is nice. It's a hobby to make up new stories and for them to serve a function of their own for the audience and engage them. There was an American psychologist called Prashansky who developed ideas within what he termed place identity as a part of eco-psychology back in the early days of eco-psychology. But I say early days, eco-psychology still is pretty young. So, when it was even younger than it is now. And one of his arguments is that stories and traditions is not just kind of collective stories with other people, but even family stories, that's the tree where my granddad proposed to my grandmother, that sort of thing, which would be of no interest to anybody else, but it's a story within your lineage. That's what helps us bind to place. And if you've got nothing to bind you to a place, when the bulldozers turn up to concrete it over and turn it into a car park, you're not going to be chaining yourself to a tree to protect it because you don't give a monkeys. You're not linked to the place. Whereas if that place is part of your identity and somebody does want to concrete it over, suddenly it's not just an attack on a tree or a rock or a river. It's also an attack on you and other members of your community. And it becomes a fight worth having, which I suppose maybe is a little bit selfish that we only get involved in fights that directly affect us. but that's human nature for you. So it's understandable that the story can then serve the additional function of binding, of linking that bunch of people to that place. And why are you doing that?
We have a kind of anti-story around here in Guildford. There's a hill near Guildford that's called St. Martha's Hill. And you walk up it and you really feel the power of the place. You go, oh, this is wonderful, yeah? And on top of it, there's a big Christian church. But there's no water, so there's no reason to have a Christian church there at all. And it's called St. Martha's Church, but nobody knows who the Martha is, yeah? And it's thought it might be a collection of martyrs, but nobody knows what martyrs there are either, yeah? But you go into the church, there's a big picture of St. Michael killing the devil.
The dragon.
So they're slaying the earth energy, basically. So the reason the church is there is to hold that earth energy away from local people, yeah? And
could be. Although you could, now what was his name? I should remember because I used to know him. He's been dead a few years now. Chap who used to go around with swords, doing what I suppose, for lack of a better word, you could call geographic acupuncture. Yeah. That he would insert these swords in various ley line spots. He said it was. I never saw him do it, so I don't know. What the experience was like because I was never there at the time. But just as on a human body, you got the idea that in acupuncture, lines of energy through the body, and sometimes they can be blocked. And if you stick a needle in here and a needle in there, it will unblock the flow of energy, and the chi will move as it's meant to move. His rationale was in much the same line, that he was not stopping the energy from going into certain places, but he was unblocking it or redirecting it. Yeah. So, were the churches put there? And possibly in some cases they were put there to put a block on the flow of energy, but it's possible that some monuments and churches and what have you were there to unleash stagnating energy, or a bit like redirecting a river from flowing to the left to flow to the right. Maybe some of it was about redirecting. We don't want the energy to go there, we want the energy to go there for whatever reason. And then that structure, whether it's a church or a standing stone or whatever it might be, possibly could serve as a redirection.
In the literature of the place, it talks about several druid circles on the hill, but no one knows where these are. Yeah, so all these layers of myth are creeped to each other. Yeah,
probably under the foundations of the church.
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Julie, you're going to say something?
Oh, I think churches are fascinating. I'm not sure about this, like the idea of energy moving, but I've often thought about the idea of pilgrimage between different places as being related to old stories, perhaps. I've often wondered if those pilgrimage routes might have been old routes of learning, so that, if the land itself is kind of the book full of all of these stories with, the land as a mnemonic device, maybe a pilgrimage route was a kind of university program that you would go on to learn different things in different places. And, maybe the churches are put in those places because they were, supplanting their ideas and their stories in those places, obviously.
Like a rebranding.
But they would have been other stories linked to those passages and routes. It's interesting that you mentioned there was no water there, because that, I think would have been such an important part of pilgrimage as well, to make sure that you're at a place where you can find fresh water and accommodation, as it would have been, before the monasteries were taken away. I'm so fascinated in looking at that more. I'd love to learn more about the pilgrimage routes and how the stories are related to them.
Well, the famous one is Santiago de Compostela, isn't it? Where you were supposed to go on to Finisterre, where there was an altar where you would greet the rising sun and burn your sandals on the altar there, yeah? And they put Santiago de Compostela in the middle of it and before the end. So they created a whole new mythos about it, because there's no real evidence that St. James was ever in that part of the country. Yeah.
Where is that?
That's in Spain, yeah.
In Spain, right.
Yeah. So they thought there was a route called the Route of Hercules, a path that you walked across Europe to get this place. And they've interrupted it with later buildings and things.
Early capitalism. There's plenty of money to be had from pilgrims.
Well, it's early tourism, really, isn't it? But people probably were traveling to learn as well. Like it's clear in a lot of the mythology that people were traveling from different places, around different places and between different parts of the country, and the British Isles as a whole, really, and Norway too. There's stories of people going over to Norway to learn.
Absolutely.
And it's fascinating.
One of my longer term ambitions, when I can finally get myself organised, is to go back over to Ireland again and do the Cuchulainn route of the geographical locations associated with various different stages of his story.
Is that the Táin? Is that, I heard that they were creating a walk based on the story of the Táin, or is it other parts? There is
one as well. There's several mythologically linked tourist routes in Ireland, which I think they're twigging to the fact that there is. They used to talk about the pink pound and the grey pound, and that there is now a. I don't know, what colour would the pagan pound be? Purple.
Green. The green pound.
But, just as there's money to be had from Christian pilgrims, so there's money to be had from pagan pilgrims.
That's a big thing in Orkney now, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Orkney spiritual tours, because there are so many sacred sites in Orkney. And
a lot of people from Australia go on those tours because it's nice to have a bit of a pilgrimage trip.
Yeah.
When years ago, when I graduated, I got a summer job, really, working on the Larne Stranraer ferry, which goes from Scotland to Ireland, back and forth. It's a very troppy crossing, so I spent half of it with my head over the side of the boat. At one point, which I found just kind of surreal, really, we got a bunch of Americans turn up, and one of the people who worked on the boat permanently said, they do this every year. They were descendants of the Titanic survivors.
Wow.
So, the I suppose great, however many times over, grandchildren of the original survivors. And every so often they'd turn up and they'd do the tour of the shipyards and the docks and the places linked to the stages of the Titanic's journey, from its creation through to its setting sail. And part of it was to go over to Ireland. A very kind of personal pilgrimage to their own ancestry. But it's interesting that they'd want to see sites, including things that the ancestors who drowned would never have been in the docks where the ship was made. They'd have just got on the dock, at the dock where it sailed from. They wouldn't have been involved in all of those other stages of the ship. But that notion of pilgrimage, of reiterating your own story, because I had kids with them, and I'm sure they must have gone, this is where great-great-grandma did so-and-so thing, and this is... So they'd have been reinforcing the family story to their own younger generations as they dragged them, kicking and screaming around this pilgrimage tour. And that's quite... I just find that quite fascinating, this need for story, to know... And I wonder, you having mentioned Australians, Americans, parts of the world where there's a very large population descended from immigrants, whether that becomes part of wanting to know where granddad came from, or wanting to know where great-great-aunt so-and-so came from. So as well as knowing the stories of where you are now, also wanting to know the stories of 5 generations earlier, where they came from.
Yeah, this is why ancestry.co.uk is so popular these days. Loads of people are researching ancestry, and ancestors are a big part of Druidry as well. Yeah, and in our case, in the Ovate course, the one that causes the most problems is the ancestors. Believe it or not, everyone has problems with their parents or their family, and some far more so than others. Yeah.
Yes, it's a debate about to be done.
Sorry. I think it's fascinating how people have sometimes got really diverse ancestral backgrounds as well, and how that they have to kind of negotiate that within their Druidry and understand how they can bring it together to make their personal story. And it's fascinating that you brought up the Titanic story, and I wonder if I could ask you, to what degree do you feel like we have to look at things that happened a long time ago in our local area if we're connecting with the landscape, or does it, balance out with things that are more recent? I feel like it's good to recognize all of it. But what do you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's an interesting one. It's also part of changing identity. So I've got a number of friends from Punjabi descent, and over the years we've had lots and lots of conversations about different things, and often there'd be a TV program on about the let's say the Tudors or whatever it might be, and in conversation, one of them particularly who really likes history will say, well, these are our ancestors. Now, biologically, they're not, because his grandparents obviously came from the Punjab. They're not directly related to any of the Tudor royalty. But it's become absorbed for him as part of his history. So his history is not just his actual biological blood lineage going back to the Punjab a few generations ago and the intervening generations in Britain since then, but it's also the fact that he identifies as British, and therefore he's as much interested in British history from 1,000 years before his family moved to Britain as he is in the living memory part of it. And that's, again, who you acquire. These days, obviously, all these shouty, screechy people on the internet love bandying around terms like cultural appropriation when it suits their purposes. I don't want to get bogged down in that because I think it's a fruitless discussion. But if you identify with a period of history, whether you are biologically part of it or not, I think is kind of neither here nor there. So you look to a period of history in a country you live in, or you've moved to, or whatever, and those stories become your stories because you've got a love for them.
That's good, because do you have to be of Celtic origin to be a Druid? No. I would say not. Yeah, it's open to everyone, as you say, if you see yourself in that way.
No, I mean, from my point of view,
it's quite a difficult subject sometimes because cultural appropriation is something that I think that we really need to consider, especially living in Australia. It's really important for us to learn about Aboriginal culture, and pay our respects to the local Indigenous people. But that doesn't mean that we can just take whatever we want and use it. You can't do that. There's open practices and there's closed practices, and there's some that are kind of, they're open. Anyone can use them like Celtic practices, but you can't just sort of make it whatever you want. There's some, guidelines, or there's some people that know about it a bit more than others and things like that. So I think it's a really important thing to understand, but it's different in every place as well. I've always really liked thinking about the idea of three ancestors as the ancestors of our bloodlines. So we might connect to that through our heritage and places that, our ancestors have been from. And then there's the ancestors of the land that we're in, and the history, not just the First Nations, although that's really important, if that's part of our place's history, but also all of the history that's led to us being in the place that we're in. So all, everything like that Titanic story, or the folklore stories or whatever. And then I think there's also your ancestors of inspiration, and that can be anything. So anybody can come into Druidry and be a part of it. They don't have to be from Celtic heritage. But you recognize that there's this person taught me about it. I got that, they got that from there, and that, it has this sort of lineage of learning and truth and knowledge sharing. And that's like the ancestral story of that. So that's how I like to think about it. So
absolutely. Coming from a polytheist background, my feeling is that the gods will call whoever the hell they want to call. They don't need me to rubber stamp someone's passport before they're allowed to be called. So, no matter where somebody comes from, that's their choice. But it is, I can understand that it becomes a controversial area where people feel their identity is under threat. And then certainly in Greek paganism, Norse paganism, a variety of traditions, there are very definite movements that are Greek gods for Greek people, Norse gods for Norse people, that sort of, you've got to be of a certain ethnicity, and even more than that, you've got to be fluent in the language, so you'll have someone who say, well, yes, you're Greek, but you don't speak Greek properly. Therefore, you don't really count. You're not proper Greek. You're just kind of playing at it, sort of thing. So, and in a Druid context, there's plenty of people in Ireland who can't speak Gaelic. there's plenty of people in Wales who can't speak Welsh, even though their families maybe have been there since the year dot. So the definitions of who's in the club and who's not in the club can get quite heated. And certainly if you do feel your identity is threatened, you might get quite stroppy about who's allowed in and who's not. But it's not a healthy route to go down, I don't think. It's quite a explosive.
It's important to be sensitive, I think, about that.
Yeah, because the same thing's happening in America as happening in Australia with people discovering Native American culture and activities and things. Yeah, and again, you got to be careful what part of it you can actually access and which bits you can't. Yeah. So
there are quite strict rules about ownership and protocol in Australia about Aboriginal culture, and it's very different to, Druidry is more of a revived tradition where there isn't, clearly identifiable elders. Not all cultures are the same and not all traditions are the same. I think you just have to take it on. It's part of that, being part of your local place, knowing what those, the politics around that, the tensions and the difficulties and the dynamics and the need for respect and the, sense of ownership or threat, or, privilege as well. Like who, where is that balance of power, which can be really uncomfortable and really damaging sometimes. There's a real need for patience and sensitivity and humility, I think, when we approach that.
I think there's also the significant risk with the issue of power of communities splintering. So let's say we're talking about Irish Druidry, and you've got one group of Irish people who think this and another group of Irish people who think the dead opposite. Who's correct? So you come at it as let's say, an English person or an American person or an Australian person, and one group will let you in and the other group won't let you in. So it's not even as if all of an Indigenous population is agreed on something.
Oh, it's the same with Aboriginal culture. Yeah, there's lots of different opinions. But, we're all human. And it's I think that one of the beautiful things about Druidry is this focus that we've always had, in all parts of what we do, that it's about relationship. It's about relationship with the land and with nature and with your ancestors and with the spirits and with any other aspect of things that you work with. And I think it's the same with your local community. Mm-hmm. It's about the relationships that you make.
Yeah, the history of your place is part of your Druidry as well, and the popular culture that makes you what you are. You can't get away from it. If you want to live more holy in this world, you have to acknowledge all that, definitely. Yeah. So we've got about 2 minutes left before Rachel's going to throw us off. So maybe burning to say anything.
I wonder if there are any questions from the group.
They would have come up if they were there.
There's a few comments, not so much questions, but there are some comments on the typed section.
Quick, get them in.
We've got one from a while ago from Isabel commenting on whether, I think that was when, Brendan, you were talking about the church being built on the top of that hill. A comment about whether that was a redirection of the local pagans to get them to be more Christian by, demolishing whatever was there beforehand and plonking a church in there instead.
I think she's absolutely right. Yeah, you need to build your culture on what's gone there before. And if there's a sacred site to some other culture, you have to make your own mythos around it to incorporate it. Yeah, so quite correct.
Was the dragon, do you think the dragon was ever representative of paganism, and that killing the dragon was killing paganism?
Yeah, I think the earth powers, as Robin was saying, yeah.
Right, that's what the earth powers meant in that context.
It could well be paganism, yeah.
From a Christian perspective, the dragon is Satan. It's the forces of evil. So it's, but then again, I suppose for a fair number of Christian missionaries in the past, and probably a few still today, paganism is of the devil anyway. So it kind of depends on who you think the devil is.
Not for everybody. We've got some Christians in our group who are really lovely.
There are plenty who don't.
It's wonderful.
Going back historically.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Historically, it was a little bit more tenuous for sure.
There's a comment there from Sam Johnson saying that a good combination of tech and meditation is a computer game Plane, which helps encourage taking regular time to meditate. So don't know that one. So maybe that's good. Yeah. A way to get some techno druidry in there. And now we better shut up because we got to go for this one.
Thanks
So
for
thanks
the
for your
chat,
attendance.
everyone. That's great.
Thank you. Lovely talking to both of you. And
And you.
Yeah.
thanks for listening if you're out there. Yeah. Thank you. Bye.